The axe blade bit deep into the oak, sending a sharp crack echoing across the frostbitten meadow. Cordelia Finch wiped the sweat from her brow despite the November chill, her calloused hands trembling not from cold but from exhaustion. The pile of split wood beside her cabin remained pitifully small, barely enough to last 3 days, let alone the brutal Montana winter bearing down on Millbrook Valley. She raised the axe again, muscles screaming in protest. 6 weeks had passed since consumption claimed her husband, Jeremiah, leaving her alone with their modest homestead and a dwindling pile of coins that wouldn't stretch to hiring help. At 32, Cordelia had never imagined she'd be splitting wood until her back ached and her palms bled. But pride ran thicker than desperation in her veins. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her pause mid-swing. Through the bare branches of the cottonwoods, she spotted a magnificent black stallion carrying a man she'd seen only from a far Beaumont Ashworth, whose sprawling cattle ranch dominated the northern valley. His wool coat probably cost more than she'd see in 3 years, yet he dismounted with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. Mrs. Finch. He tipped his hat, revealing silver-streaked dark hair and eyes, the color of storm clouds. "I've been watching you work from the Ridge Road." Heat flooded her cheeks. The idea of him observing her struggle felt more intimate than if he'd caught her in her chemise. "Mr. Ashworth, I wasn't aware my daily routine provided entertainment for the local gentry." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Hardly entertainment. More like admiration mixed with concern." His gaze swept over the meager woodpile, then back to her face. "Winter's coming hard this year. The almanac's calling for the worst cold spell in 2 decades. I'm managing just fine, thank you." She hefted the axe again, determined to prove her point, but her grip slipped on the sweat-slicked handle. The tool clattered to the frozen ground, and she bit back a curse that would have scandalized the church ladies. Beaumont stepped closer, close enough that she caught the scent of leather and cedar that clung to him. "When did you last eat a proper meal?" The question caught her off guard. She couldn't remember, maybe yesterday, the day before. Time had blurred into an endless cycle of chopping, stacking, and falling into her empty bed, too exhausted to dream. "That's none of your concern," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. He bent to retrieve her axe, his fingers brushing hers as he pressed it back into her hands. The brief contact sent an unexpected jolt through her, warm and unsettling. "Let me help you. I don't accept charity." "Who said anything about charity?" His eyes held hers steadily. "I'm talking about neighbors helping neighbors. Community, the very foundation this valley was built on." Something in his tone made her waver. She'd been so focused on maintaining her independence that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone genuinely offer assistance without judgment or pity. "Why?" she asked quietly. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Because," he said finally, "some things are too precious to watch slip away." 3 days later, Cordelia heard the rumble of wagon wheels before dawn broke fully across the valley. She peered through her frost-etched window to see Beaumont approaching with a team of draft horses pulling a wagon loaded with split firewood, more wood than she could have chopped in a month of back-breaking labor. She met him at the door, still in her nightgown with a shawl hastily thrown over her shoulders. "Mr. Ashworth, what is the meaning of this?" He climbed down from the wagon seat, moving with that same effortless confidence she'd noticed before. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Finch. I thought you might appreciate some assistance with your winter preparations. I told you I don't accept charity." But even as she spoke the words, her eyes betrayed her, lingering on the blessed sight of that mountain of seasoned oak and hickory. "And I told you, this isn't charity." He began unloading logs with practiced efficiency. "My men cut more than we needed for the ranch. Rather than let it go to waste, I thought you might help me solve a problem." She watched him work, noting the way his muscles moved beneath his wool shirt, the careful precision with which he stacked each piece. This was no soft gentleman. Farmer Beaumont Ashworth knew honest labor. "You're lying," she said, but there was no heat in her accusation. He paused, a log balanced in his hands. "Perhaps, but it's a lie that serves both our purposes." His gray eyes found hers again. "Unless you'd prefer to freeze out of principle." Despite herself, Cordelia felt the beginnings of a smile tug at her lips. "You're infuriatingly persistent. My late wife often said the same thing." The mention of his deceased spouse hung in the air between them, heavy with shared understanding of loss. "How long?" she asked quietly. 3 years come Christmas." He resumed stacking wood, his movements more deliberate now. Scarlet fever. She was everything good in this world. Cordelia stepped closer, close enough to see the grief lines etched around his eyes. "Jeremiah used to say I was too stubborn for my own good. Said I'd argue with a fence post if it disagreed with me. Sounds like a wise man." He was. She picked up a piece of kindling, turning it over in her hands. "I don't know how to be anything but independent. It's all I've ever known." Beaumont's hands stilled on the logs. "Independence is a fine thing. But there's a difference between standing on your own feet and standing alone." The truth of his words settled into her bones like warmth from a good fire. She'd been so busy proving she could survive without help that she'd forgotten the simple pleasure of human connection, of shared burdens and willing hands. "Thank you," she said simply. "For the wood, for your kindness." He nodded, then hesitated as if weighing his next words carefully. "Mrs. Finch, Cordelia, if I may, would you consider joining me for Sunday dinner? Nothing improper, just neighbors sharing a meal." Her heart performed an odd little skip. Yes, I think I'd like that very much." As he prepared to leave, he turned back with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Cordelia, next time you need anything, please don't wait until you're at the breaking point to ask for help." She watched him drive away, her cheeks burning despite the cold morning air. For the first time in weeks, the future didn't seem quite so impossible. Sunday arrived, wrapped in pristine snow that transformed Millbrook Valley into something from a fairy tale. Cordelia stood before her small mirror, fussing with her hair in a way she hadn't done since her courting days. Her best dress, a deep blue wool that brought out her eyes, had been carefully mended where moths had found it during her months of neglect. The walk to Beaumont's ranch took her past the small cemetery where Jeremiah rested beneath a simple wooden cross. She paused there, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. "I don't know what I'm doing, my love," she whispered to the headstone, "but I think you'd want me to try living again." The Ashworth ranch house rose from the snowy landscape like something from a dream, 2 stories of warm yellow clapboard, with wide porches and tall windows that glowed with lamplight. Cordelia had admired it from afar for years, never imagining she'd walk up those front steps as an invited guest. Beaumont answered her knock wearing clothes she'd never seen on him, a charcoal wool suit that emphasized his tall frame. His hair neatly combed back. The sight of him so formally dressed made her pulse quicken in an entirely inappropriate way. "Cordelia," his smile was warm, genuine. "You look beautiful." Heat climbed her throat. "Thank you for inviting me." He led her through rooms decorated with understated elegance, Persian rugs over polished hardwood, oil paintings of pastoral scenes, furniture that spoke of quality rather than ostentation. Everything was immaculate, yet lived in, comfortable rather than imposing. In the dining room, a table set for 2 awaited, complete with china that probably cost more than her entire homestead. But it was the effort that moved her, the carefully arranged flowers, the gleaming silver, the way he'd clearly taken pains to make everything perfect. "I should confess something," Beaumont said as he held her chair. "I haven't entertained guests since Millicent passed. I was afraid I'd forgotten how." "You haven't forgotten anything," Cordelia assured him, settling into her seat. "This is lovely." The meal was simple, but expertly prepared roast beef with potatoes and winter vegetables, followed by apple pie that melted on her tongue. But it was the conversation that nourished her starved soul. They talked about everything: books they'd read, places they'd traveled, dreams they'd once harbored. "I always wanted to see the ocean," Cordelia admitted over coffee. "Jeremiah promised we'd go to San Francisco someday, but the farm always needed something. ... "The Pacific is worth seeing," Beaumont said, "especially at sunset. The way the light catches the waves. It's like watching liquid gold. You've been several times. Business trips mostly, but I made time to stand on the shore." He leaned forward slightly. "There's something about all that vastness that puts life in perspective." As the evening wore on, Cordelia found herself relaxing in ways she'd forgotten were possible. Beaumont was an attentive listener, asking thoughtful questions and sharing stories of his own. When she mentioned her love of reading, he immediately led her to his library, a room lined floor to ceiling with volumes that made her heart sing. "Please," he said, gesturing to the shelves, "borrow anything that catches your eye." Books are meant to be read, not merely displayed. She selected a volume of Tennyson's poetry, running her fingers over the leather binding. "Are you certain?" "More than certain." He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "I've been hoping for an excuse to share them with someone who would appreciate them." Their eyes met and held, and Cordelia felt something shift between them: a recognition, an acknowledgement of possibility. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her, and the realization that she wanted him to both thrilled and terrified her. Instead, he stepped back, ever the gentleman. "I should see you home before the weather turns." December arrived with a vengeance, blanketing the valley in snow deeper than anyone could remember. Cordelia woke one morning to find her cabin nearly buried, the windows completely obscured by drifts that reached above her head. Panic fluttered in her chest as she realized her woodpile, even with Beaumont's generous addition, was buried somewhere beneath tons of snow. She spent the morning digging frantically with a kitchen spoon, the only tool she could find, her hands growing numb despite her thick mittens. By noon, she'd managed to uncover perhaps a day's worth of fuel, and the storm showed no signs of abating. That's when she heard it, the deep voice calling her name through the howling wind. She struggled to the front door, forcing it open against the accumulated snow to find Beaumont leading a string of pack horses, all laden with supplies. "Thank God," he breathed when he saw her. "When the storm hit, I was afraid. ... He didn't finish the sentence, but she saw the genuine fear in his eyes, the relief that made his shoulders sag. "Beaumont, you shouldn't have come out in this weather. It's too dangerous." "Dangerous would be leaving you here alone." He began unloading supplies with swift efficiency: food, lamp oil, blankets, and blessed firewood already split and dried. "Pack whatever you need. You're coming to the ranch until this passes." "Can't possibly." "Cordelia," his voice was firm but gentle, "this isn't a request. Look around you. This cabin won't withstand another day of this storm, and I'll be damned if I lose you to stubborn pride." The raw emotion in his voice stopped her protests cold. She stared at him, this man who'd charged through a blizzard to rescue her. Snow clinging to his eyebrows and beard, his face reddened by cold, but his eyes blazing with determination. "Why?" she whispered. "Why does it matter so much to you what happens to me?" He was quiet for a long moment, his breath forming clouds between them. When he spoke, his voice was rough with honesty. "'Cause somewhere between watching you split wood with bleeding hands and sharing Sunday dinner, I fell in love with you, Cordelia Finch, and I can't bear the thought of a world without you in it." Her heart stopped, then started again with painful intensity. "What?" "I know it's too soon. I know you're still grieving, still finding your feet as a widow. I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give." He stepped closer, cupping her face gently in his gloved hands. "I'm just asking you to let me keep you safe. Let me take care of you the way you deserve to be taken care of." Tears froze on her cheeks before they could fall. "I'm scared," she admitted, "scared of needing someone again. Scared of what it means, I'm scared too, he said softly. But I'd rather be afraid together than alone. She nodded, unable to speak around the emotion clogging her throat. Together, they packed her few precious belongings: Jeremiah's Bible, her mother's quilts, the Tennyson volume Beaumont had loaned her. As they prepared to leave, she took one last look around the cabin that had been her refuge and her prison. I'll bring you back when the storm passes, Beaumont promised, reading her thoughts. But for now, come home with me. Home. The words settled into her heart with surprising rightness. Maybe home wasn't a place at all, but the person who'd risk everything to make sure you were safe. The journey to his ranch was treacherous, but Beaumont guided them with sure hands, never once letting her feel unsafe. When they finally reached his house, warm and bright against the storm, Cordelia felt something inside her chest unclench for the first time in months. She was going to survive this winter. More than that, she was going to live. The storm raged for 5 days, trapping them in a cocoon of warmth and growing intimacy. Beaumont had installed Cordelia in the guest room that had once belonged to his late wife's sister, treating her with perfect propriety, even as the air between them crackled with unspoken longing. They fell into an easy rhythm, mornings spent reading by the fire while snow continued to pile against the windows. Afternoons in the kitchen, where Cordelia insisted on helping with meals despite his protests. She discovered he was an excellent cook, something that surprised and delighted her. Millicent was delicate, he explained one evening as they prepared dinner together, especially toward the end. I learned to cook because I wanted to tempt her appetite with her favorite foods. Cordelia's hands stilled on the potatoes she was peeling. She was lucky to have someone who loved her so completely. I thought I'd used up all my capacity for that kind of love, he said quietly. I thought it died with her. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Cordelia felt her pulse quicken. A tell. Now I know the heart is more resilient than we give it credit for. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his shaving soap, see the flecks of green in his gray eyes. Now I know that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, it multiplies. That night, as wind howled around the house, they sat before the fire, sharing memories. Cordelia found herself telling him things she'd never spoken aloud: her dreams of traveling, her secret attempts at writing poetry, her fear that she'd been a disappointment as a wife because she and Jeremiah never had children. A disappointment? Beaumont's voice was incredulous. Cordelia, you're the strongest, most remarkable woman I've ever known. Any man would be blessed to have you as his wife, even knowing I may never bear children. He was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. I had a daughter once. She lived only 3 days. His voice was rough with old pain. Millicent never recovered from the loss, physically or emotionally. We tried for years after that, but ... he shrugged. Some gifts aren't meant to be ours. Cordelia reached for his hand without thinking, lacing their fingers together. I'm sorry. What I learned, he continued, is that love takes many forms. A marriage built on companionship, respect, and genuine affection is worth more than one blessed with children, but lacking in understanding. They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the fire burn low. When Cordelia finally rose to retire, Beaumont caught her hand. Stay, he said softly. Just, stay here with me, by the fire. I promise to behave as a gentleman should. She hesitated for only a moment before settling back onto the sofa, this time close enough that their shoulders touched. When he wrapped a blanket around them both, she didn't protest. When she dozed against his shoulder sometime near midnight, she felt safer than she had in years. She woke at dawn to find herself curled against his chest, his arm around her protectively. He was already awake, watching her with an expression so tender it made her breath catch. Good morning, he whispered. Good morning. She made no move to pull away, to content in the circle of his warmth. Cordelia, he said, his voice serious. When this storm passes, when you go back to your cabin, I want you to think about something. What? Marrying me? Her heart lurched. Beaumont, I'm not asking for an answer now. I know it soon. No, you need time. But I want you to know that my intentions are honorable, completely honorable. His hand stroked her hair gently. I love you, Cordelia. Not as a replacement for Millicent, but as yourself. As the fierce, independent, beautiful woman who's captured my heart so completely, I can barely remember what life was like before you. She lifted her head to look at him, seeing nothing but sincerity in his storm-gray eyes. What if I'm not ready? What if I never am? Then I'll wait, he said simply. However long it takes, however long you need. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to ease. But inside, wrapped in Beaumont's arms, Cordelia felt her own walls beginning to crumble. Spring arrived like a promise kept, transforming the valley into a canvas of green and gold that took Cordelia's breath away. She'd returned to her cabin after the storm as planned, but the distance between her homestead and Beaumont's ranch had never felt so great. They saw each other regularly. He found excuses to check on her fence repairs. She discovered reasons to ride past his property, but the easy intimacy of those snowbound days seemed like a dream. May brought wildflowers and a proposal that arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. Cordelia was tending her garden when Beaumont appeared with a small bouquet of prairie roses and a nervous expression she'd never seen on him before. He'd been coming by daily since the snow melted, sometimes to help with chores, sometimes just to talk over coffee on her small porch. These made me think of you, he said, offering the flowers. Beautiful, resilient, with just enough thorns to keep a man honest. She laughed, accepting the bouquet and breathing in their sweet scent. Flattery will get you everywhere, Mr. Ashworth. I certainly hope so. His expression grew serious. Cordelia, we've been dancing around this for months now. The whole valley's talking about the widow and the wealthy rancher, speculating about our intentions. He'd crept up her neck. People do love to gossip. Let's give them something worth talking about. He dropped to one knee right there in her herb garden, pulling a small velvet box from his jacket pocket. Cordelia Finch, will you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife? The ring was perfect, a simple band of white gold set with a single sapphire the color of mountain lakes. Not ostentatious, not overwhelming, but beautiful in its understated elegance. Beaumont, ... She breathed, her hands trembling as she reached for him. I know you need more time, he said quickly. I know there are concerns about the difference in our circumstances, about what people will say. Yes, he blinked. Yes, you need more time. Or, yes, I'll marry you. The words came out in a rush, surprising them both. Yes, Beaumont Ashworth. Yes, absolutely yes. His face transformed with joy as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had always belonged there. When he kissed her their first real kiss, Cordelia felt the last of her walls crumble completely. When, he asked against her lips. Soon, she said, surprising herself again. I don't want to wait anymore. I've spent too much of my life waiting for someday. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church where Jeremiah was buried, with half the valley in attendance. Cordelia wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit, and carried a bouquet of the same prairie roses Beaumont had brought to her garden. The ceremony was simple but perfect. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, and Beaumont kissed her in front of God and everyone, Cordelia felt a completeness she'd never experienced before. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up on the wide front porch and lawn. The whole community came together to celebrate farmers and merchants, ranchers and their wives, even the stern Methodist ladies, who'd initially disapproved of their courtship. As evening fell and lanterns were lit, Beaumont led his new wife onto the makeshift dance floor. They swayed together to the sound of fiddle music, completely absorbed in each other. Are you happy? He asked, his voice low and intimate despite the crowd around them. Happier than I ever imagined possible, she answered truthfully. Are you? Complete, he said simply. For the first time in years, I feel complete. Later, as guests began to depart and the last of the lanterns flickered in the evening breeze, Cordelia stood on the porch of what was now her home, watching the stars appear one by one over Millbrook Valley. Second thoughts, Beaumont asked, joining her and wrapping his arms around her waist from behind. She leaned into his warmth, marveling at how right it felt. None whatsoever. You. Only that we should have done this sooner. 1 year later, Cordelia stood in the same spot where she'd first met her husband, watching him demonstrate the proper technique for splitting wood to a group of young men from town. The irony wasn't lost on Hershey, who had once struggled alone with bleeding hands, now oversaw a household staff of 6 and managed the charitable works that had become her passion. Mrs. Ashworth called Mavis, the young housemaid they'd hired from town. The ladies from the church auxiliary are here about the winter relief fund. Cordelia smiled, still unused to her married name after all these months. Send them to the drawing room. I'll be right there. The Winter Relief Fund had been her idea way to ensure that no widow or struggling family in Millbrook Valley would face the kind of desperation she'd known. Beaumont had embraced the project wholeheartedly, contributing not just money but also organizing the men of the valley to donate labor and supplies. As she walked toward the house, she caught sight of her reflection in the parlor window and paused. The woman looking back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who'd wielded that axe with bleeding hands. This woman was confident, well-dressed, purposeful. But more than that, she was loved and loving in return. The church ladies were in their element, planning distribution schedules and debating the relative merits of coal versus wood for the poorest families. Cordelia listened with half her attention. The other half focused on the sound of her husband's laughter drifting through the open windows. Mrs. Ashworth, said Mrs. Patterson, the auxiliary president. We were wondering if you might speak to that new widow, Mrs. Carmichael. She's been trying to manage that farm of theirs alone, and pride's making her refuse help. Cordelia's heart clenched with recognition. Of course, I'll ride over tomorrow. Later that evening, she and Beaumont sat in their favorite spot by the fire. She with her needlework, and he with his account books. The peaceful domesticity of it struck her sometimes how natural they'd become together, how effortlessly they'd merged their lives. Penny, for your thoughts, he said, looking up from his ledgers. I was thinking about Mrs. Carmichael. The ladies want me to talk to her about accepting help. Beaumont set aside his work and gave her his full attention. And that troubles you? It reminds me of myself. The stubborn pride, the fear of being seen as weak or dependent. She set down her sewing and looked at him directly. What if you hadn't been so persistent? What if I'd succeeded in driving you away? You couldn't have, he said with quiet certainty. I was already too far gone. But what if? He moved to the sofa beside her, taking her hands in his. Cordelia, my love, there are no what-ifs in our story, only what is. And what is? He gestured around them, encompassing their home, their life, their love. What is exceeds every dream I ever dared to have. She studied his face. This man who'd seen her at her lowest and loved her anyway. Who taught her that accepting help wasn't weakness, but wisdom, that love could indeed multiply when shared. I want to take her firewood, she said suddenly. Mrs. Carmichael, I want to load up a wagon and take her enough wood to last the winter. Beaumont smiled, the expression lighting his entire face. Of course you do, and of course we will. She'll refuse at first. Probably, she'll be suspicious of our motives. Almost certainly. She'll think we're looking down on her, feeling sorry for her. Without question. He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. And you'll persist anyway, because that's who you are. That's who you've always been, even when you were too hurt to see it clearly. 2 days later, they loaded a wagon with split wood and drove to the Carmichael farm. As predicted, the young widow met them with suspicion and pride, insisting she could manage alone. Cordelia climbed down from the wagon and looked the younger woman in the eyes. I was you 6 months ago. splitting wood with bleeding hands, too proud to accept help, too scared to admit I was drowning. Something in her tone must have reached through the woman's defenses, because her rigid posture softened slightly. The difference, Cordelia continued gently, is that someone saw past my pride to my need and refused to let me freeze out of stubbornness. Now I'm asking you to let us pay that kindness forward. As they unloaded the wood together, all three of them working side by side, Cordelia caught her husband watching her with an expression of such profound love and admiration that it took her breath away. Later, driving home in the gathering dusk, she reached for his hand. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what? For seeing me, for saving me, for loving me enough to fight for us when I was too afraid to fight for myself." He brought her gloved hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "Thank you for letting me, for trusting me with your heart, for making me believe in second chances." Above them, the first stars of evening appeared in the sky, painted with the colors of sunset, gold and rose and deep purple. Beautiful and wild and full of infinite possibility, just like the love they'd found in each other and the life they were building together in Millbrook Valley. As their wagon rolled home through the gathering darkness, Cordelia Ashworth knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the best chapters of a life story begin not with grand adventures, but with the simple courage to let someone else help you carry the load.